The bustling Atlanta International Airport was alive with its usual morning chaos. Business travelers rushed past families on vacation, while airline staff expertly navigated through the crowds with their rolling suitcases. At Gate B23, passengers were beginning to line up for Delta Airlines Flight 2847 to San Francisco. Among them stood Mrs. Thompson, a middle-aged corporate executive who carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from years of flying first class. Her designer blazer and perfectly styled hair made it clear she was someone who paid attention to appearances. She impatiently tapped her expensive shoes against the airport's polished floor while checking her phone, barely looking up at the other passengers around her. Just a few feet behind her in line, a young Army sergeant stood quietly in his crisp military uniform. His combat boots were spotless, his uniform pressed to perfection, and his posture straight as an arrow. Despite his professional appearance, there was a gentleness in his eyes that spoke of someone who had seen both the best and worst of humanity during his service. What neither of them noticed was the distinguished-looking older gentleman standing several people back in the boarding line. His silver hair and commanding presence drew respectful glances from other passengers, though none recognized him as retired General Richards, a highly decorated military officer who had served his country for over 3 decades. As the gate agent began the boarding announcements, Mrs. Thompson clutched her first-class ticket a little tighter. She had paid good money for her seat and was looking forward to enjoying the comfortable 5-hour flight to San Francisco. She had an important presentation to prepare for, and the peace and quiet of first class was exactly what she needed. Now boarding our active duty military personnel and first-class passengers for Delta Flight 2847 to San Francisco, the gate agent's voice rang out clearly through the terminal. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, already pulling out her boarding pass. Behind her, the young sergeant reached into his uniform pocket for his economy ticket. Just moments before, at the check-in counter, a thoughtful airline employee had quietly processed a complimentary upgrade for him, a small gesture of appreciation for his service that would soon set in motion a chain of unexpected events. The morning sun streamed through the airport's massive windows, casting long shadows across the terminal floor. Outside, ground crews prepared the aircraft for departure, their movements precise and practiced. Inside, passengers continued to gather around the gate, unaware that they were about to witness something that would challenge their perspectives and touch hearts across the nation. General Richards observed the scene with keen interest. Years of leadership had taught him to read situations and people well, and something about the way Mrs. Thompson carried herself, the slight edge of superiority in her posture, the dismissive glances she cast at other passengers, caught his attention. He adjusted the position of his carry-on bag, making sure he had a clear view of what was about to unfold. The line began to move forward as passengers presented their boarding passes one by one. The gentle beeping of the scanner created a steady rhythm, punctuated by the gate agent's friendly welcome aboard to each person who passed through. The morning still held all the promise of ordinary travels, but that was about to change dramatically. As Mrs. Thompson strode confidently toward the jet bridge, her heels clicking against the floor, she remained blissfully unaware that her actions in the next few minutes would not only test her own character, but would also spark a conversation that would reach far beyond this airport terminal. Behind her, the young sergeant waited patiently for his turn to board, holding his newly upgraded ticket, while General Richards maintained his quiet vigilance from his position in line. The stage was set for a powerful reminder about humanity, prejudice, and the unexpected ways life tests our character when we least expect it, and it would all begin the moment they stepped onto that plane. The interior of the Delta aircraft hummed with activity as passengers made their way down the aisle, storing bags and finding their seats. The soft overhead lighting created a warm atmosphere in the first-class cabin, where plush leather seats awaited their occupants. Flight attendants moved efficiently through the space, helping passengers settle in and offering pre-flight beverages. Mrs. Thompson walked with purpose through the first-class cabin, her designer handbag swinging gently at her side. She quickly located her window seat in the third row and began arranging her belongings. She had done this countless times before. Laptop positioned perfectly on the wide armrest, reading glasses in easy reach, and her cashmere travel wrap draped just so across her legs. The young sergeant followed shortly after, double-checking his boarding pass as he approached the first-class cabin. He still couldn't quite believe his luck. In his 6 years of military service, he'd never experienced anything quite like this upgrade. He moved carefully through the aisle, conscious of his uniform and not wanting to disturb anyone with his standard-issue backpack. As he approached row 3, he paused, looking down at his boarding pass one more time. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely to Mrs. Thompson, who was now typing rapidly on her phone. "I believe I'm in the seat next to you." Mrs. Thompson's fingers froze mid-text. She looked up slowly, her eyes moving from the surgeon's combat boots to his uniform, and finally to his face. The pleasant expression she had worn moments ago vanished, replaced by one of obvious displeasure. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet cabin. She pressed a flight attendant call button repeatedly, her manicured finger jabbing at it with increasing urgency. A flight attendant appeared almost immediately. A kind-faced woman in her 40s who had seen her fair share of in-flight situations. "How can I help you?" she asked, maintaining her professional composure. "This gentleman," Mrs. Thompson said, gesturing dismissively toward the surgeon, "seems to think he belongs in first class. Clearly, there's been a mix-up with the seating arrangements." The flight attendant glanced at the surgeon's boarding pass, then smiled warmly. "No mix-up at all, ma'am. The surgeon has been upgraded as part of our airline's military appreciation program. This is his assigned seat." Mrs. Thompson's face flushed red. "But I paid full price for my ticket," she protested, her voice rising slightly. "I specifically chose this seat for its location. Surely you can find him another place to sit." Other passengers in first class began to take notice of the exchange. A businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper. A couple in the row ahead turned around to watch. The surgeon stood quietly, his face neutral but his hands clasped tightly behind his back, a military stance that helped him maintain his composure. "Ma'am," the flight attendant began diplomatically, "all our first-class seats are identical in terms of comfort and service. However, if you prefer to move, I can check if there are any other available seats in this cabin." The suggestion that she should be the one to move seemed to offend Mrs. Thompson even more. "I most certainly will not move," she declared. "I selected this seat weeks ago. I'm a frequent flyer with executive status. Surely that counts for something." Throughout this exchange, the surgeon maintained his dignified silence. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, his posture perfect, though anyone looking closely might have noticed the slight tightening of his jaw. He had faced much worse than this during his service, but somehow this felt different, more personal, more painful. What nobody had noticed yet was that General Richards had just entered the first-class cabin. He paused in the entrance, taking in the scene before him. His years of command experience had taught him the value of timing, and he watched carefully as the situation continued to unfold. Other passengers were now openly staring, some recording discreetly with their phones. The air in the cabin grew thick with tension as Mrs. Thompson continued to argue with the increasingly patient flight attendant. The surgeon's upgrade paperwork was produced and verified, but Mrs. Thompson remained unsatisfied. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she insisted, her voice carrying to the back of the plane now. "I demand to speak to your supervisor. There must be someone on this flight with the authority to sort this out properly." Little did she know that someone was standing right behind her, and he had seen and heard everything. The next few moments would change the entire atmosphere of the flight, and perhaps teach a lesson that would resonate far beyond this aircraft cabin. The first-class cabin had become unnaturally quiet, with only the soft hum of the aircraft's ventilation system filling the air. Every passenger within earshot was now fully invested in the drama unfolding in row 3, though many pretended to be absorbed in their phones or magazines. "I simply cannot believe this is happening," Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice trembling with what seemed to be both anger and embarrassment. "Do you have any idea how much I paid for this ticket?" She rifled through her designer handbag, pulling out her phone. "I'm going to have to call my travel agent. This is completely unacceptable." The flight attendant, whose name tag read Betty, maintained her professional demeanor, though a slight crease had appeared between her eyebrows. In her 23 years of flying, she had handled countless difficult situations, but this one was quickly becoming memorable for all the wrong reasons. "Ma'am," Betty tried again, her voice low and steady. "I understand your concerns, but I need to remind you that we're delaying our departure. The surgeon's upgrade is valid, and this is his assigned seat. Now, I'd be happy to—" Mrs. Thompson cut her off with a dismissive wave of her hand. "You clearly don't understand. I have an important business presentation to prepare for during this flight. I cannot be distracted by—" She paused, gesturing vaguely at the surgeon without looking at him. "I need peace and quiet to work." Several passengers exchanged glances. A young woman in the row behind pulled out her phone and began recording discreetly. An elderly gentleman across the aisle shook his head disapprovingly at Mrs. Thompson's behavior, while his wife whispered something that made him nod in agreement. The surgeon, still standing perfectly straight in the aisle, finally spoke. His voice was quiet but clear, carrying a dignity that made several nearby passengers lean in to listen. "Ma'am, if my presence would disturb you that much, I'm happy to return to my original seat in economy." This selfless offer seemed to trigger something in Betty's expression. Her professional smile flickered for just a moment, replaced by a look of determination. "That won't be necessary, Sergeant. Your upgrade is valid, and you have every right to be here." Mrs. Thompson's face flushed an even deeper shade of red. "Well, I never," she exclaimed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'd like to speak to the captain. Surely the captain would understand my position. I'm an executive-level frequent flyer." A businessman sitting across the aisle suddenly closed his laptop with an audible snap. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying clearly, "I'm also an executive-level frequent flyer, and I would be honored to sit next to a member of our armed forces." This unexpected intervention caused a ripple of murmurs through the first-class cabin. Mrs. Thompson turned to glare at him, but before she could respond, another voice joined the conversation, an elderly woman 3 rows ahead who had turned around in her seat. "Young lady," she called out, her voice wavering but stern, "my late husband was a military man. He would be ashamed to witness this behavior. That young man's uniform deserves your respect." The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted noticeably. What had started as one woman's complaint had evolved into something larger, a moment that forced everyone present to confront their own values and prejudices. Mrs. Thompson glanced around, suddenly aware that she had lost the support of her fellow first-class passengers. Her fingers nervously adjusted her pearl necklace as she realized her position was becoming increasingly untenable. Yet something in her refused to back down. "This isn't about his uniform," she insisted, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "This is about my right as a paying customer to have a comfortable flight. I demand to speak to a supervisor right now." Betty straightened her uniform jacket and spoke with quiet authority. "I'll have to ask the cabin supervisor to come speak with you, ma'am. However, I should inform you that causing a delay in our departure could result in additional complications." The surgeon remained standing in the aisle, his face a mask of patience and professionalism. Though he hadn't moved or spoken much, his dignified bearing stood in stark contrast to Mrs. Thompson's increasingly flustered behavior. Just then, a deep voice spoke from the rear of the first-class cabin. "I believe I might be able to help sort this situation out." The voice carried the kind of authority that made everyone, including Mrs. Thompson, turn to look. What happened next would not only resolve the immediate conflict, but would teach a lesson about prejudice, respect, and consequences that none of the passengers would soon forget. All heads turned toward the commanding voice at the back of the first-class cabin. General Richards made his way forward, his presence immediately commanding attention. Even in civilian clothes, there was no mistaking his military bearing. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and his posture spoke of decades of service and leadership. The general moved with purposeful steps until he stood directly in the aisle, positioning himself between Mrs. Thompson and the surgeon. The younger soldier immediately recognized the bearing of a superior officer and stiffened his posture even more, if that was possible. "Ma'am," General Richards began, his voice carrying the weight of authority but remaining surprisingly gentle, "I couldn't help but overhear your concerns about seating arrangements." He paused, letting his words settle in the hushed cabin. "I think I might be able to offer some perspective on the situation." Mrs. Thompson, who had been about to launch into another protest, found herself momentarily speechless. There was something about this man's presence that made her usual tactics feel suddenly inappropriate. "I'm retired General Richards," he continued, "and I've spent over 30 years in service to our country." He turned slightly, acknowledging the sergeant with a respectful nod. "Young man, may I ask where you've served?" The sergeant responded with crisp professionalism. "2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq, sir. Just returned from my 3rd deployment 3 weeks ago." The general nodded thoughtfully, then turned back to Mrs. Thompson. "You mentioned earlier that you're concerned about having a peaceful flight to prepare for your business presentation." His voice remained calm but carried an edge of steel beneath its surface. "Let me tell you about what this young man has been doing while you've been preparing presentations." The entire cabin was silent now, every passenger completely invested in the scene unfolding before them. The flight attendant, Betty, stood quietly nearby, her earlier stress replaced by an expression of deep interest. "This uniform," the general gestured to the sergeant's attire, "represents something far more valuable than a first-class ticket. The men and women who wear it put their lives on the line every day so that we can all go about our business freely, whether that's flying across the country or giving presentations." Mrs. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her earlier indignation wilting under the general's steady gaze. A few passengers nodded in agreement with his words, while others continued recording the interaction on their phones. "You see, ma'am," the general continued, his voice taking on a more contemplative tone, "I've commanded hundreds of soldiers over my career. I've sent them into harm's way. I've written letters to their families when they didn't come home, and I've watched them display the kind of courage and dignity that money simply cannot buy." He paused, looking around the cabin before continuing. "The young sergeant standing here has probably seen more in his few years of service than most of us will see in a lifetime. He's faced real danger, real challenges. And yet, when you questioned his right to sit here, he responded with nothing but respect and was even willing to give up his seat to keep the peace." Mrs. Thompson's face had lost all its color. Her hands, which had been gesturing animatedly earlier, now lay still in her lap. The businessman across the aisle nodded approvingly at the general's words, while the elderly couple a few rows ahead wiped tears from their eyes. "Now," the general said, his voice softening slightly, "I understand you paid good money for your ticket. But this isn't about money, is it? This is about something much more important. It's about respect, dignity, and the values we claim to stand for as a nation." The impact of his words was palpable. Several passengers dabbed at their eyes with tissues. The young woman who had been recording everything hadn't moved her phone, but her other hand was pressed against her heart. "So, Mrs. Thompson," the general concluded, "I have a simple question for you. When you look at this soldier now, what do you see? Do you see someone who doesn't belong in first class? Or do you see someone who's earned his place here many times over, not through money or status, but through sacrifice and service?" The cabin remained absolutely silent as everyone waited for Mrs. Thompson's response. The moment seemed to stretch on forever, heavy with the weight of choice and consequence. The next few words spoken would either heal or deepen the wounds that had been opened in the past few minutes. The tension in the first-class cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mrs. Thompson sat frozen in her seat, the general's words hanging heavily in the air. Around them, passengers held their phones steady, capturing every moment of this unexpected confrontation. The general cleared his throat and continued, his voice taking on a warmer tone. "You know, while we're discussing service and sacrifice, there's something else you might want to know about our sergeant here." He turned to the young soldier. "Would you mind if I shared a bit about your recent deployment?" The sergeant shifted slightly, his humility evident in his hesitation. "Not at all, sir," he replied quietly. 3 weeks ago, the general began, addressing not just Mrs. Thompson now, but the entire cabin. This young man led a rescue mission that saved the lives of 12 fellow soldiers. Their convoy had been hit by an explosive device, leaving them stranded in hostile territory. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. The businessman who had spoken up earlier leaned forward in his seat, his expression a mix of awe and respect. Despite heavy enemy fire, the general continued, his voice filled with pride. He coordinated an evacuation that got every single one of his wounded comrades to safety. For his actions that day, he was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor. The general paused, letting the weight of this revelation sink in. But that's not all he's done for his country. Mrs. Thompson's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water bottle. The elderly couple a few rows ahead were openly wiping tears from their eyes, and even Betty, the flight attendant, had to compose herself before checking her tablet for an update from the gate. When he's not deployed, the general went on, our sergeant here runs a non-profit organization. Would you like to tell them about it? He asked, turning to the young soldier. The sergeant straightened his already perfect posture. We help homeless veterans find housing and jobs, sir, he said simply, his voice humble but clear. Last year, we managed to help over 200 veterans get back on their feet. Several passengers nodded appreciatively. A young woman in business attire quickly wiped away a tear, trying to hide her emotion. The phones recording the scene hadn't wavered. If anything, more had appeared. 200 lives changed, the general emphasized. 200 American heroes who served their country and fell on hard times now have a second chance. He turned back to Mrs. Thompson. And this is the man whose presence you found so disturbing. Mrs. Thompson's face had gone through several shades of red during this revelation, finally settling on a deep crimson. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, words failing her for perhaps the first time in her life. The businessman across the aisle cleared his throat. Sergeant, he called out, his voice thick with emotion. I'd be honored to shake your hand if you'd allow it. Others in the cabin murmured in agreement. A quiet ripple of conversation spread through the cabin as more passengers learned about the sergeant's achievements. Some were already pulling out their phones to look up his veteran support organization. Others were sharing the video they'd captured, their fingers flying across their screens as they typed out messages to friends and family. You know what strikes me most? The general addressed the cabin at large, though his eyes remained fixed on Mrs. Thompson. It's how this young man responded to your treatment of him. Despite everything he's accomplished, despite the lives he's saved and the difference he's made, he was willing to give up his seat and return to economy class. That kind of humility, that kind of character, you can't buy that with any amount of frequent flyer miles. The elderly woman who had spoken up earlier dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. My late husband was right, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. The uniform doesn't just represent service, it represents the very best of who we can be. As these revelations continued to ripple through the cabin, Mrs. Thompson seemed to shrink further into her seat. The phone she had been wielding so confidently earlier now lay forgotten in her lap. Her earlier demands for a supervisor seemed almost laughably petty in light of what she'd just learned. The scene was being captured from multiple angles now, and everyone knew this moment would live far beyond this flight. In the age of social media, such powerful moments of truth and consequence rarely stayed contained. The story of the decorated sergeant, the prejudiced passenger, and the general's intervention was already beginning its journey across the digital landscape, destined to spark discussions in homes and offices across the country. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had transformed completely. What had started as a scene of conflict had evolved into something entirely different, a moment of collective reflection and changing perspectives. Mrs. Thompson sat quietly in her seat, her earlier bravado completely deflated as she processed everything she just learned. She began, her voice barely above a whisper, I don't know what to say. Her hands fidgeted with her pearl necklace, a nervous habit that betrayed her discomfort. Several passengers who had been recording the scene kept their phones trained on her, waiting to see how she would handle this moment of truth. Betty, the flight attendant, stepped forward with professional grace. Ma'am, would you like to move to another seat? We do have a few options available. Her voice was kind, offering Mrs. Thompson a dignified way to extract herself from the situation. The businessman across the aisle spoke up again. I'd be happy to switch seats with you, he offered, though his tone suggested he was more interested in sitting next to the sergeant than in helping Mrs. Thompson escape her embarrassment. Mrs. Thompson shook her head quickly. No, that won't be necessary. Her voice trembled slightly. I'll stay here. She glanced briefly at the sergeant before looking away, unable to meet his eyes. The general nodded approvingly, but his expression remained serious. Sometimes, ma'am, the best thing we can do when we've made a mistake is to sit with our discomfort and learn from it. Around the cabin, other passengers began sharing their own thoughts and reactions. A middle-aged teacher in row 5 spoke up, her voice carrying clearly. My students need to hear this story, she said, still recording on her phone. They need to understand that character isn't about what class you fly in, it's about how you treat others. The elderly couple who had been watching everything unfold turned to each other, sharing a knowing look. The wife spoke softly to her husband, but her words carried in the quiet cabin. Remember when people treated you that way when you came back from Vietnam? Some things take too long to change. The sergeant remained standing in the aisle, his dignity intact despite everything that had happened. A young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, peeped around her mother's seat from the row behind. "Mommy," she whispered loudly, as children often do, "is he a real hero?" Her mother smiled warmly. "Yes, sweetheart, he is. And he just taught us all a very important lesson without saying much at all." The tension in Mrs. Thompson's shoulders was visible as she tried to make herself as small as possible in her seat. Her phone had been buzzing continuously with notifications, likely from people who had already started sharing videos of the incident, but she ignored it completely. "Sir," the sergeant finally addressed the general, "thank you for your words, but there's really no need for all this attention." His humility only served to underscore everything the general had said about his character. A round of quiet applause broke out in the cabin, causing the sergeant to blush slightly. The businessman who had offered his seat stood up, extending his hand. "Thank you for your service and for showing us what real class looks like." Other passengers began to follow suit, offering their own words of appreciation and support. Some shared business cards, asking about his veteran support organization and how they could help. The elderly gentleman with his wife wiped away tears as he saluted the young soldier. Betty returned with an update from the cockpit. "We've been cleared for departure," she announced professionally, though her eyes were bright with emotion. "If everyone could please take their seats." Mrs. Thompson finally looked up at the sergeant as he prepared to take his seat next to her. I apologize," she said quietly, her voice thick with shame. I was completely out of line." The sergeant nodded politely but said nothing as he settled into his seat. His silence spoke volumes about his character. No gloating, no righteous anger, just quiet dignity. The general, still standing in the aisle, gave one final nod of approval before returning to his own seat. As he passed Mrs. Thompson, he paused briefly. "The measure of a person isn't in how they act when everything's going their way," he said softly. "It's in how they handle their mistakes and learn from them." As the cabin crew began their final preparations for takeoff, the atmosphere remained charged with emotion. Phones were reluctantly turned to airplane mode, but everyone knew this story wouldn't end with this flight. In the digital age, moments like these take on a life of their own, spreading far beyond their original context to touch lives and change hearts across the world. As Flight 2847 cruised at 35,000 feet somewhere over the American heartland, the first-class cabin had settled into a thoughtful quiet. The initial drama had given way to something deeper, a shared experience that had touched everyone present in unexpected ways. Mrs. Thompson sat silently, her laptop closed and forgotten in front of her. The important presentation she had been so worried about earlier seemed trivial now. Every few minutes, she would glance sideways at the sergeant, who was quietly reading a book about veteran rehabilitation programs, his posture still perfectly straight even in the comfortable first-class seat. Throughout the flight, other passengers kept finding reasons to walk past their row. Some stopped to shake the surgeon's hand, others to slip in business cards with whispered offers of support for his non-profit organization. A young executive 2 rows ahead had already drafted an email to his company's charitable foundation about a potential partnership. The elderly couple who had spoken up earlier made their way back from the restroom and paused at their row. The wife gently touched the surgeon's shoulder. "My husband served in Vietnam," she said softly. "He knows what it's like to face prejudice while wearing the uniform. Thank you for handling it with such grace." The sergeant looked up from his book, offering a warm smile. "Thank you, ma'am." "And sir," he nodded to her husband, "welcome home." The old veteran's eyes welled up with tears as he gave a shaky salute. His wife guided him back to their seats, both of them visibly moved by the exchange. Meanwhile, even as the plane continued its journey westward, the story was spreading across social media like wildfire. Passengers in economy class who had heard about the incident were sharing what they knew. The videos taken by various first-class passengers had already begun circulating online, gaining thousands of views and shares. A news producer in row 7 was quietly typing on her phone, preparing a pitch to her network about covering the surgeon's veteran support organization. The businessman who had first spoken up was already on his laptop, drafting a company-wide email about unconscious bias and the importance of respect in the workplace. Betty, the flight attendant, moved through the cabin with professional efficiency, but she took extra care when serving their row. "Can I get either of you anything?" she asked, her warm smile encompassing both the sergeant and Mrs. Thompson. Mrs. Thompson, who had barely touched her water since takeoff, shook her head. The sergeant politely requested a coffee black. As Betty moved away, Mrs. Thompson finally gathered the courage to speak directly to him. "I've been sitting here for hours," she said quietly, trying to understand why I acted the way I did. "I'm not. I don't usually." She trailed off, struggling to find the right words. The sergeant turned to her with a kind expression. "Sometimes we all need a reminder to look beyond our first impressions," he said gently. "What matters is what we learn from these moments." From his seat several rows back, General Richards observed the interaction with quiet satisfaction. He'd seen countless battles in his military career, but sometimes the most important victories were won in everyday moments like this, one heart and mind at a time. As the flight began its descent into San Francisco, the impact of what had transpired continued to ripple outward. Delta Airlines' social media team was already responding to the viral videos, releasing a statement reaffirming their commitment to treating all passengers with dignity and respect. They announced an expansion of their military appreciation program and a new partnership with the surgeon's veteran support organization. The young girl who had called the sergeant a hero earlier had fallen asleep, clutching a drawing she'd made of him in his uniform, with the words "My New Hero" written in crayon across the top. Her mother carefully folded it and asked Betty to deliver it to him before they landed. When the plane finally touched down at San Francisco International Airport, something unusual happened. As the seatbelt sign turned off and passengers began to stand, no one rushed to get their bags. Instead, they waited, allowing the sergeant to exit first, a small gesture of respect that spoke volumes. As he made his way down the aisle, passengers from both first class and economy reached out to shake his hand or simply nod in appreciation. Mrs. Thompson remained in her seat, watching as the man she had initially judged so harshly was honored by everyone around him. The story didn't end at the airport. In the days that followed, it became a catalyst for important conversations about prejudice, respect, and the often invisible sacrifices of military service members. The Surgeon's Veteran Support Organization received an outpouring of donations and support, allowing them to expand their services to help even more veterans in need. Mrs. Thompson, deeply affected by the experience, wrote a lengthy public apology that was shared alongside the viral videos. She detailed how the incident had forced her to confront her own biases and announced her company would begin a partnership with veteran support organizations. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on the individuals who witnessed it firsthand. A powerful reminder that sometimes the most important battles we fight are against our own prejudices, and that true character reveals itself not in moments of comfort, but in moments of challenge and change.